All right, well, welcome back tonight. We are going to be covering the cardiovascular system tonight. And again, this is another lecture that I think is pretty straightforward. It does have, again, some pathways that I'm going to want you to know. And I will, like I normally do with these types of pathways, I'll take a blank slide and draw it out for you. Like the blood flow through the heart is going to be one of those pathways that I want you to know. And so, again, for emphasis, I will draw out that pathway and tell you exactly what I'm expecting you to know for those larger pathways. So let's get into the cardiovascular system. This is kind of a fun slide to start on. If you look, this is a normal sized heart. And this is actually a heart that is enlarged quite a bit, as you can see, by alcoholism and high blood pressure. It's covered in scar tissue as well. And because it's covered in scar tissue, the enlarged heart is actually about twice the normal size that it should be. So such what we call alcoholic cardiomyopathy actually weakens the heart so that it is unable to pump blood adequately. So again, a larger heart is not a better heart in this case, or not a healthier heart by any means. So anyway, just to show you the difference in size there between a normal heart and then an individual, normal heart here and then an individual with alcoholism and high blood pressure. So kind of interesting. Real quick here, I'm just going to go ahead and set up my pen color to be red tonight, kind of appropriate for the cardiovascular system. So the cardiovascular system, of course, includes the main pump, which is the heart, and then all of the vessels. And the vessels are going to be the arteries, which are going to, we'll kind of get into this a little bit later, but arteries are going to carry blood away from the heart. You're going to see that they don't always, usually they're carrying oxygenated blood, but there's going to be an exception to the rule, and that's going to be the pulmonary arteries. The pulmonary arteries are still going to be carrying blood, again, away from the heart, but as you're going to see, they're going to carry deoxygenated blood. So this is, again, an exception to the rule. For the most part, usually arteries are carrying oxygenated blood. But you're going to see when we do the blood flow through the heart, the pulmonary arteries are the exception. Capillaries are going to be these tiny blood vessels that connect arteries to veins, and you'll see that this is where oxygen and nutrients will leave the blood vessels. And so this is, the capillaries are these very thin vessels that will allow exchange to occur between the tissues and the blood. And then we have our veins, and our veins again are going to always carry blood to the heart. And again, for the most part, they're normally carrying deoxy. But not all veins carry deoxygenated blood. And as you're going to see, the exception to the rule in this case is going to be the pulmonary veins. And the pulmonary veins will actually be carrying oxygenated blood back to the heart, from the lungs back to the heart. So again, there are exceptions to the rules. So hint, hint, if you got like a true false question, true false, okay? Do arteries always carry oxygenated blood? Your answer would be false. Okay? They don't always carry oxygenated blood, and there's going to be that exception. The pulmonary arteries and the pulmonary veins are not going to follow the rules. Okay? So this is usually a question that throws students off right here, and I, hint, hint, put it on almost every exam. So, oh, I wrote all over my slide there. Let's do this. A functional cardiovascular system is obviously vital, but critically important for supplying oxygen to your tissues and supplying nutrients to your tissues. And then it's also very important for removing waste products as well. So waste products, again, being things like carbon dioxide, is a very important waste product that's removed from the blood or from the tissues, and then moved into the blood. And obviously, again, that something like carbon dioxide would eventually be carried from the blood to the lungs and then released. So, structure of the heart. The heart is a hollow, cone-shaped muscular pump. So again, you can see it's kind of cone-shaped. I guess that's a little bit of a stretch, but sure, we'll call it cone-shaped. And again, it's a muscular pump. So it is a very muscular organ, and it lies, of course, within the thoracic cavity, the chest cavity. The size and the location of the heart. So the size of the heart, believe it or not, you don't have to know this. This is why I don't have it down here, but some people want to know it. The average heart is about 19 centimeters by 4 centimeters. That's average. So again, the average heart is pretty close to the size of your fist, a little bit bigger than your fist. The heart lies in what's called the mediastinum. It's right under the sternum, and it rests on top of the diaphragm, which would be, again, the diaphragm would be this big muscle down here. So yeah, so again, I don't expect you to know the size. I do want you to know the location that the heart lies in what's called the mediastinum. All right, coverings of the heart. So hopefully this is a little bit of review from the very beginning of the semester, but we're going to go into a little bit more detail in terms of all of the coverings for the heart. So the main covering for the heart is what we call the pericardium, and the pericardium completely encloses the heart. It's made up of two main layers. The first layer is the outermost layer called the fibrous pericardium, and the fibrous pericardium consists of a dense connective tissue. So it's a real fibrous, dense connective tissue. And that fibrous pericardium then surrounds a more delicate double-layered sac. And this double-layered sac is going to be your parietal and your visceral pericardium. So if you remember from the very beginning of the semester, we have these serous fluid sacs that cover many of our organs that are contracting. And because the heart is contracting and we need to reduce friction, we have this double-layered sac with serous fluid on the inside. And the outer layer of the sac that's closest to the fibrous pericardium is going to be the parietal pericardium. And so again, this forms the inner lining of the fibrous pericardium right up here. Okay, so again, you've got the fibrous pericardium on the outside, and then the parietal pericardium just on the inside. And then you'll have serous fluid, okay, in between these two layers. And then the most inner layer of the pericardium is going to be the visceral pericardium, also called the epicardium. Same thing, guys. Visceral pericardium equals epicardium. Just two names for the same thing. Okay? And that visceral pericardium is what surrounds the heart directly. So just as a reminder, I'll come back to that slide in just a minute, but I want to jump ahead to remind you of the difference between the visceral and the parietal pericardium. So if you could picture, okay, your fist being the heart, okay, and a balloon being the serous pericardium. If you were to take your fist and punch it into a balloon, the innermost layer of that balloon that directly touches your hand, okay, or the heart, is going to be the visceral pericardium. So this layer right here is the visceral pericardium, okay? Now then this membrane folds back on itself here, and this outer layer out here is called the parietal pericardium. So this here is the visceral pericardium because it's right up against the viscera, right? It's right up against the heart. That's what viscera means. Visceral mass means an organ, okay? And I always tell people, to help them remember that, I don't like to eat visceral mass, so I don't like to eat, escargot and mussels and things like that because there's organs in there that you're eating visceral mass. So again, that's the visceral pericardium right up against the heart of the organ. And then the parietal pericardium you can think is on the periphery, more towards the outside. So that's your parietal pericardium on the outside there, okay? And then if you had a fibrous pericardium, then you have the fibrous pericardium on the outside of that, okay? Okay, so let's go back and look at this picture now. So if you look at this picture here, you can see this actually breaks it down for you. This shows you here the fibrous pericardium. So this is the fibrous pericardium. And then just to the inside of that, you're going to have the parietal pericardium, and then you'll have the visceral pericardium. And the space in between the parietal pericardium and the visceral pericardium is called the pericardial cavity. And that's where you're going to have all that serous fluid that helps to reduce friction. So that's where you have all that serous fluid. And then on the other side of the visceral pericardium, here, now you're going to have the heart, right? This is all the heart. So again, these were all the linings to the heart. The fibrous layer, the parietal pericardium, the pericardial cavity, and the visceral pericardium. That's all the lining of the heart, hence the name pericardium. And then this is all the heart. And we'll talk about how you can break the heart down into the epicardium, myocardium, and endocardium in just a minute here. So at the base, and by the way, so this is a excellent diagram to come back to because in a minute when we go over these layers, this covers everything. So that is an excellent diagram to kind of commit to memory. Hint, hint. At the base of the heart, the visceral pericardium again folds back to become the parietal pericardium, and that lines the fibrous pericardium. So it's just kind of reviewing those different layers. And again, remember it's that serous membrane that folds back on itself that forms the visceral layer and the parietal layer of the pericardium. And again, this is something, look at those diagrams because I think it's hard to remember what the visceral pericardium is and the parietal pericardium is unless you picture that, again, that fist being punched into a balloon. It's easy then to picture the visceral and the parietal pericardium. Between the parietal and visceral pericardium, again, like I talked about, there's that space called the pericardial cavity, and that's where it's filled. Not filed, but filled with serous fluid. And that serous fluid, again, helps as kind of this gelatinous fluid that helps to take some of the impact from the heart contracting, and that helps to reduce friction as the heart contracts inside that mediastinum. So again, and you can see this also shows the layers of the heart as well, so that you can see, the fibrous pericardium on the outside, and then the parietal pericardium would be towards the inside of that, and then the visceral pericardium would be covering the organ itself. So, and actually this is a better picture of that. You can see, so again, here's the visceral pericardium directly covering the heart, and then you would have the pericardial cavity here, and then here you have the parietal pericardium, and then on the outside here you have the fibrous pericardium. So then you get into the walls of the heart, or the wall of the heart, and that consists of three major layers. We have the epicardium, which technically is the visceral pericardium. So this is what we consider to be the outermost layer of the heart. So it's kind of weird because the visceral pericardium is considered to be both the outermost layer of the heart and then also considered to be the innermost layer of the pericardium surrounding the heart. So I know that ends up being a little confusing, and I don't know why they chose to include the epicardium as the part of the wall of the heart. But anyway, it is included. So the epicardium, just so you know, the epicardium is the same thing as the visceral pericardium. Okay, they are the one and the same. Then just inside of that is going to be the myocardium. And think of myo, again, remember that word myo means muscle. So this is the muscular layer of the heart. So this consists mostly of cardiac muscle. And it's a very thick layer because of that. And then the endocardium is the innermost layer, and it consists of, again, epithelial tissue and connective tissue. And that connective tissue, as you'll see, will become continuous with things like the valves of the heart. So here you can see this, again, this shows you all the layers. You start with the fibrous pericardium out here. Here's the fibrous pericardium. Then just to the inside of that is going to be the parietal pericardium. Then we have the pericardial cavity here that's filled with that serous fluid. Then the innermost lining here, lining the heart, is going to be the visceral pericardium, or also called the epicardium. Again, one and the same. Okay, so that's that innermost lining there. Then you have the myocardium, which is really the meat of the heart there. So that's the myocardium, all that cardiac muscle. And then the endocardium here is going to be this inner lining. When you look at the myocardium again, the myocardium consists of all of these muscular bundles of cardiac muscle, and that the cardiac muscle fibers are kind of swirl diagonally around the heart in these interlacing bundles, and that's really important again for the contraction of the atria and then the ventricles as what we're going to call a syncytium, all as one. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about this when we get into the atrioventricular contraction. So now let's get into the heart chambers and valves, and this will help to kind of bring us into how we're going to break up the blood flow through the heart. So as you're probably already familiar with, the heart has 4 internal chambers. It has the 2 receiving chambers called the atrium. That's why they were named atria, after like an atria in a house. It's the welcoming chamber. Okay, so again, the atria are going to receive blood. They're welcoming the blood in. And then you have, and obviously the atria are on top. And then you have the 2 ventricles below, and the ventricles again are going to be the larger portion of the heart. So if you're looking at this diagram here would be the atria, and then here are going to be the ventricles below. Okay, you can see the ventricles again. We'll talk about the layer of myocardium or muscle there is going to be much thicker for the ventricles, and we'll talk about why that is. So again, the ventricles are going to contract to force blood out into the vessels and towards the tissues. So there's a septum that divides the atria and the ventricles. Okay, so there'll be a septum that divides the atria and the ventricles. Here. And that septum is called the interventricular septum. And so again, you can see part of that septum right here, the interventricular septum. And so again, the word inter, to help you remember, inter means between, ventricular, so in between the ventricles. And again, they named it interventricular because even though it still divides the atria, it's just that it's much larger, and the ventricles are larger. Each also has what's called an atrioventricular valve. And this valve is going to be, again, between, just like it sounds, between the atrium and the ventricles. The right AV valve is called the tricuspid valve. Okay, so that's your right AV valve or atrioventricular valve. And the left AV valve is called the bicuspid or the mitral valve. Okay, so again, in this case here, this would be your tricuspid valve right here. And then here would be your bicuspid or mitral valve on this side. And each of these valves are going to have cusps, which are going to have these kind of stringy, fibrous structures called the chordae tendineae that attach them to what are called the papillary muscles. And you'll see this in just a minute here. So here you can see, here are the valves here. And so in this case here, this would be the tricuspid valve, and this is the bicuspid valve. And you can see they're attached to these muscles right here called the papillary muscles. These are called the papillary muscles here. And those valves are attached to those via these chordae tendineae. These fibrous connective tissue structures, chordae tendineae. Also, in this is a nice diagram to go back to because it's going to show you all your blood vessels. And it also shows you your atria and your ventricles. So here again is your right atrium. Here is going to be your left atrium. Here's going to be your right ventricle. And here is your left ventricle. And here you can see that interventricular septum. And so we'll come back and talk about, some of these vessels here. So the chordae tendineae, again, are going to be these fibrous connective tissue structures that are attached to the papillary muscles in the inner heart wall, and they're going to contract. The papillary muscles will contract during ventricular contraction to prevent the backflow of blood through the AV valves. So as the ventricles are contracting here, we don't want to push blood back into the atria because that would, again, be very inefficient. So because the atria just contracted to push blood into the ventricles. So when the ventricles contract, these papillary muscles will contract as well, and basically close up those valves so that way then blood can't flow backwards from the ventricles to the atria. That's the purpose of the AV valves. So here you can see, this is just showing you the AV valves are going to open and allow blood to flow from the atria into the ventricles when ventricular pressure is lower than atrial pressure. So basically when atrial pressure is higher. So you can picture again, this would be like, if the air pressure was much higher outside of your house than inside your house, it could blow the door open. So if you have, a bunch of wind, it could blow the door open. And that's exactly what's happening here with your valves. So again, when you get a much higher pressure in the atria, or the atrium, each atrium versus the ventricles here, then that will basically blow open that valve. Just like when you blow open a door, and that way then the blood can flow through that valve. Now, when the pressure in the ventricles becomes higher than the pressure in the atria, then we'll actually close this valve, and that's going to happen when the ventricles contract. And so when those ventricles contract, those papillary muscles are going to contract as well, and that's going to close up that valve. And that way then that will prevent the backflow of blood from the ventricles back into the atria. So that's how your AV valves work. Also, when you look at the heart, you have what we call the skeleton of the heart. It forms kind of the structure of the heart, or helps to provide structural integrity for the heart. And that is this kind of fibrous, dense connective tissue that forms in these rings that surround the valves of the heart. And it will actually merge with the interventricular septum. So this dense connective tissue helps to provide kind of a support structure for the heart valves. It provides an insertion point for cardiac muscle bundles, and it also is going to act as an electrical insulator between the atria and the ventricles as well. So let me show you what I'm talking about here. Here is this fibrous, dense connective tissue that would form the skeleton of the heart here. You can see that, and again, you can see that it's connecting the valves here. And you can see some here too. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the blood flow through the heart now. And so I want to go back to this diagram. I'm going to go through the blood flow through the heart in a couple of different ways. Okay, so and you're going to have to know the major parts that I am going to point out to you. So what happens typically is after blood, the blood makes its way to its tissues. Again, remember we have to bring oxygenated blood to the tissues. Okay, so in the tissues, okay, our arteries are bringing oxygenated blood, right, to most of our tissues here. And as they drop off that oxygen, okay, and they'll do that in the capillary beds of the tissues. They'll drop off that oxygen into the tissues and pick up carbon dioxide. They're going to come back to the heart and bring that deoxygenated blood back to the heart in the form of veins, right? Veins are what's going to bring that deoxygenated blood back to the heart. Now, all of the veins from the superior aspects of the body are going to dump into the superior vena cava, okay? And all of the veins from the inferior half of the body are going to dump into the inferior vena cava. So the inferior vena cava and the superior vena cava are going to dump both into the right atrium. Okay, the right atrium is your initial welcoming chamber for deoxygenated blood. So the right atrium will then contract, pump blood through what's called the tricuspid valve. Okay, and I'll help you remember this here in just a minute when I draw this out. They're going to pump blood through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. Okay? Now the right ventricle is then going to contract and pump blood into, and this is cut, so this would actually connect all the way down here. But the right ventricle will pump blood into what's called the pulmonary trunk through the pulmonary semilunar valve. Okay? So then that blood will make its way out through the pulmonary trunk into the left and the right pulmonary, and this is going to be the tricky part. This is going to go through the pulmonary arteries. So this is the case where pulmonary arteries are going to be carrying deoxygenated blood. The blood hasn't made it yet to the lungs, so it's deoxygenated. So the left and right pulmonary arteries are going to branch off of this pulmonary trunk, and they're going to carry that deoxygenated blood to the right and the left lung. Then in the lungs, we'll actually pick up oxygen, right, and drop off the carbon dioxide, and then that oxygenated blood is going to make its way back to the heart via the pulmonary veins. So again, remember, arteries are always carrying blood away from the heart. That's hence a artery, away from the heart. And pulmonary veins are going to be carrying blood back to the heart. And in this case, our pulmonary veins are going to be carrying oxygenated blood. So those pulmonary veins, as you're going to see here, here's your left pulmonary veins, and your right pulmonary veins would dump in here, are going to dump into the left atrium. Okay? Then the left atrium, as it fills with blood, will contract, push blood through the bicuspid valve into the left ventricle. The left ventricle is going to give a big, nice, hard contraction, and it's going to pump blood out through the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta. And then the aorta will obviously branch into many different arteries that will carry that oxygenated blood now out to the tissues. Okay? So I wanted to show you in this diagram, but I'm going to draw this out for you. So don't worry about trying to write all that down because I'm going to draw this out step by step for you. So here, this is a nice diagram so it can show you this kind of circulation through the heart. So you can see again deoxygenated blood coming in to the right side of the heart, and then that deoxygenated blood being pumped. And you may say, well, why is it bringing that blood into the heart and then into the lungs? Why doesn't it go straight to the lungs? Well, the reason being is that we need a collection place for all the deoxygenated blood from all of the tissues of the body. Bring all of that deoxygenated blood into the heart. And the heart, again, remember, is just a pump. So that way then it can pump that blood out to the lungs, that deoxygenated blood out to the lungs, where then it can pick up oxygen and come back to the heart for a second pump. And that second pump then is going to pump oxygenated blood out to the tissues. Now, as you can see here, the right ventricle, if you look at the wall, it's the myocardium here of the right ventricle, or the muscle, right, layer of the right ventricle is much thinner on the right side than it is on the left ventricle. And the reason being is that if you think about it, it makes absolute sense here, right? The right side of the heart is only pumping blood to the lungs. So it doesn't have far to go. The lungs aren't that far away from the heart. So if you were to cut open a heart, you would see that the right myocardial wall is going to be much thinner in the right ventricle than in the left ventricle. And that left ventricle has to be nice and thick because here that left ventricle is pumping blood all throughout the body. So it has to pump blood, up through the tissues, up to the top of your head. It has to pump blood to the tissues all the way to the tissues in your feet. So again, that's why the left ventricular wall is going to be so much thicker. It has to be thicker because it's pumping that blood much farther. All right, so when we talk about, oops, and I think I had a blank, here's my blank slide here. Okay, so real quick, what I want to do here is take a moment to just draw out the blood flow through the heart like I just walked you through on that diagram. And my suggestion to you is that you commit this diagram that I'm about to put up here to memory, meaning that if you could walk into the exam and I will have a blank sheet of paper for you to draw out the blood flow through the heart. If you can draw this out, then it will help you so much on some of the questions for the exam because then many of the questions are very easy if you have that diagram right in front of you. So hint, hint, this is what I think you should be able to walk into the exam and draw out on a piece of paper. Okay? And so real quick, I'm going to change my pointer here. I'm going to change the pen color to blue and I'll change it back to red here in just a minute. So first off, what I want you to do is I want you to put up at the top here, we're going to put the lungs. This would be the capillary bed of the lungs. What we call the capillary bed. Here are the lungs. And then here, down at the bottom here is going to be the capillary bed of the tissues, meaning your tissues of your body. Okay? These would be the capillary beds of your tissues. Okay, so let's start here at the tissues. So again, at your tissues, this is where your exchange of, again, oxygen and carbon dioxide is going to happen. And this is where, again, remember that oxygen is being brought to the tissues. So oxygen is going to move from blood, okay, to the tissues. And then, obviously, carbon dioxide is going to go from the tissues into the blood. Okay? And so as we're going to be bringing oxygenated blood to the tissues and the arteries, and then those arteries are going to branch into these little tiny capillaries, and that's where gas exchange happens. And as, again, the blood dumps oxygen into the tissues, then it becomes deoxygenated. Okay, and so that deoxygenated blood will move out the end of the capillaries into, of course, our veins. And so our veins are going to carry the deoxygenated blood back towards the heart. Again, remember that's what veins do. Veins carry blood to the heart. So then our veins, okay, are going to dump into the superior and inferior vena cava. Okay, and then from here, our superior and inferior vena cava are going to dump blood into the right atrium. Now, as they do that, okay, again, both of the superior vena cava, just kind of as a reminder, the superior vena cava are going to be bringing that deoxygenated blood, again, from the upper portions of the body, from the chest and the upper limbs and the head. And the inferior vena cava is going to be bringing in that blood from the abdominal area and then from the lower limbs and some of the chest region, and again up into the right atrium. So again, the superior and inferior vena cava are going to be our major dumping grounds from the veins. The veins are, again, all dumping into the vena cava that are going to dump into the right atrium of the heart. So then the right atrium will contract and, of course, pump blood into the right ventricle. And because, again, we're pumping through from the atrium to the ventricles, there is the right AV valve. We have to pump through a valve here, and that valve, again, prevents backflow from the ventricle into the atrium. So that right AV valve is called the tricuspid valve. Now, my trick for you to remember this is that you always try something before you buy it. So if you draw this diagram this way, the tricuspid valve comes first. So you try before you buy. Tricuspid before bicuspid is my trick for you for that. So, and I'm going to try to draw the valves on the side here. So there's the tricuspid valve. Then the right ventricle is going to contract, and it will pump blood into the pulmonary trunk. And there is another valve here to prevent backflow again as the right ventricle contracts and pushes that blood through this valve. It will prevent the backflow of blood from that valve back into the ventricle. And so this is where you're going to see the semilunar valves. The semilunar valves are always going to be between the ventricle and whatever blood vessel they're pumping into. So in this case, it's named after where it's pumping. It's pumping into the pulmonary trunk, so we call it the pulmonary semilunar valve. Semilunar valve. Okay, and then the pulmonary trunk is going to branch into the right and left pulmonary. And if you were in my class, I would say, what is it? Is it going to be arteries or veins? And again, in this case, okay, it's your arteries, and I didn't leave myself much room here, but your arteries, okay, because we're, again, remember, pumping away from the heart. So this is right and left pulmonary arteries, okay, because you're pumping away from the heart, arteries away. So again, this is the case where your pulmonary arteries are actually going to be carrying deoxygenated blood. So those right and left pulmonary arteries will then branch into the capillary beds of the lungs. Okay, so this is where, in the capillary beds of the lungs, that we are going to dump our carbon dioxide. So we're going to dump our carbon dioxide, not carbon dioxygen. That was a whole nother made up word that popped into my head. So it's carbon dioxide. It'll dump the carbon dioxide so we can breathe out that carbon dioxide and then breathe in, again, that fresh oxygen is going to go from, again, the lungs into the blood vessels. So now we have oxygenated blood. And so I'm going to swap my pen color here. And so now, again, we've picked up oxygen in the lungs and we've dumped our carbon dioxide. And now we have to go back to the heart for another pump so that we get, again, that blood can make it all throughout the body. So here now we're going to bring the oxygenated blood back to the heart for a pump via the pulmonary veins. And again, this is a case where veins are going to be carrying oxygenated blood in this case. And the pulmonary veins are then going to dump into the left atrium. Okay. Then the left atrium is going to give a nice contraction. And as the left atria contract, then they're going to pump blood through the left AV valve, which is now going to be the bicuspid valve or the mitral valve. Okay, same thing. And it's going to pump that blood into the left ventricle. The left ventricle will give a nice big pump and pump that blood into the aorta through the aortic semilunar valve. Oops, and I just realized I drew in an extra A there. Sorry about that. It's just supposed to be aorta. And so again, it'll pump that blood into the aortic semilunar valve. Is going to be just like our other semilunar valve in between the ventricle and the vessel that it's pumping into. And of course, it's named after the fact that it's pumping into the aorta. So that's why they call it the aortic semilunar valve. And here now, the aorta will then branch into the arteries of the body. And the arteries then of the body are going to carry that oxygenated blood to our tissues and will eventually branch into the capillary beds where our oxygen again will be unloaded in our tissues and then carbon dioxide will be picked up by the blood from the tissues into the blood. So again, this shows you the entire blood flow through the heart. Now the nice thing that I like about this diagram is that you can see, again, here you can go over your valves. So between the right atrium and the right ventricle and the left atrium and the left ventricle are our AV valves. Our right AV valve, okay, our atrioventricular valve is called the tricuspid valve. Our left AV valve is called the bicuspid valve. And this is where you can remember, you try it, you always try it before you buy it. Try before you buy. Okay? So hopefully that will help you to remember the tricuspid comes before the bicuspid. And the bicuspid valve is also called the mitral valve because they thought it looked like a bishop's mitre because it's got these two cusps. So that's why it's called the mitral valve. And so hopefully that will help you remember that it's called the mitral valve, that it looks like a mitre of a bishop, the mitre of the bishop, and it just has it's because it just has these two cusps. So that's how it got that name. And when you oftentimes talk about like leaky valves, you'll talk about things like, or stretchy valves, you'll talk about something called a mitral valve prolapse. And that's, again, talking about this bicuspid or mitral valve. And it's often because the valve has become stretched and leaky. And then, so also, the valves that are going to be in between the ventricles again and whatever vessel you're pumping into are always going to be your semilunar valves. And again, they're named after what they pump into to help you out. So again, if it's pumping into the pulmonary trunk, it's the pulmonary semilunar valve. If it's pumping into the aorta, it's the aortic semilunar valve. So this is the blood flow through the heart, and this is what I would expect you to be able to do when you walk into the room, is to be able to take a blank piece of paper and just draw this out. This is one that I suggest you draw out on a piece of paper and then post it on your, your bathroom window, or your bathroom window, not your window, sorry. Well, you can if you have a window there, but I meant to say your mirror, because your bathroom mirror is going to be a place that you're going to look every day. So you get up and you brush your teeth before you go to bed. If you have this diagram out there on your mirror, then you have to look at it. Well, I guess you don't have to, but it's a good time frame where you're gonna look at it every day. So that's my suggestion for you. So again, that's the blood flow through the heart. So now what we didn't talk about is that there's also this whole other set vessels that are going to supply the heart itself. So we talked about how the heart acts as a pump to pump, again, deoxygenated blood to the lungs and oxygenated blood to the tissues, but we didn't talk about how it actually pumps blood to itself, because it requires oxygen as well. I mean, the heart is, again, this big muscle, and so it requires quite a bit of oxygen. So it has its own blood supply. It has its own arteries and it has its own veins called the cardiac arteries and the cardiac veins. And in this case here, you can see some of these cardiac arteries. So here, this is called the right coronary artery. You don't have to know. I'm not going to ask you to label any of these, although these diagrams might be helpful for lab. But I will not ask you on the exam to label them. I just wanted you to see the cardiac arteries and veins here. So, but this is the right coronary artery, and this is the left coronary artery kind of runs around here, and then it branches off, and this portion here is called the left anterior descending artery, or the LAD artery. And the LAD is oftentimes what's called the widowmaker. So this vessel right here is called the LAD, left anterior descending artery. And it's called the widowmaker because it supplies most of the left ventricle. And so if you are to have a clot or a blockage here, let's say up here, then you are going to prevent oxygenated blood from flowing into most of the left ventricle. And that, again, can cause a very severe cardiac arrest. And that's why it's oftentimes called the widowmaker. So, but again, you don't need to know the cardiac, you need to know the specific cardiac arteries and veins for lecture, although you'll go over them in lab, but you do not need to know them for lecture. Okay, so now let's talk about the actions of the heart and what we call the cardiac cycle, which is going to be, again, your atrial contraction, your atrial relaxation, your ventricular contraction, and then your ventricular relaxation. So the cardiac cycle consists of the atria beating in unison. So the right and left atria are going to contract as one. They're going to contract at the same time. And this is what we call atrial systole. And this is going to be followed by the contraction of both ventricles, ventricular systole. Okay? And then the entire heart will relax for a very brief moment. So again, the atria will be in diastole, both ventricles will be in diastole. And that's what we call diastole, that momentary relaxation of both the atria and the ventricles. So again, we go from atrial systole, atrial contraction, then After, again, the atria relax, we go ventricular systole, okay? And then that's where the ventricles contract. And then for just a brief moment, the heart is completely relaxed in diastole. So for just a brief moment, the heart is completely relaxed before the atria contract again. During the cardiac cycle, the pressures within heart chambers is going to rise and fall with the contraction and relaxation, obviously, of the atria and the ventricles. So when the chambers fill with blood, pressure in that chamber is going to be greater than that of the following chamber or vessel. And that's what forces the valves open. So remember, just like, again, the pressure were higher outside of your house than inside, and it were to, push the door open. If you didn't have your door latched, it would push that door open. This is the same thing that happens here with our valves of the heart. So when your atria contract, okay, blood is going to fill the valves through the AV valves, through the atrioventricular valves, or the tricuspid and bicuspid valves. And that's because, again, as the atria fill with blood, the pressure is going to get higher in the atria, and then as the atria contract, then that pressure is going to get even higher as they compress that fluid in there, that blood in there. And then as that pressure, again, becomes higher than what it is in the ventricles, it's going to push blood through those atrioventricular valves. Then, when the ventricles contract, blood will be pumped into the aorta and the pulmonary trunk through those semilunar valves. So again, these are the semilunar valves. There's the pulmonary semilunar valve and the aortic semilunar valve. Okay, so what happens is when the atria contract, okay, just to, again, kind of give you an idea of what types of questions I might ask. When the atria contract, the atrioventricular valves are going to be open. Those are going to be the bicuspid valve and the tricuspid valve, okay? And the pulmonary and the aortic semilunar valves will be closed. Okay, that's when the atria contract. Now, when the atria relax and the ventricles contract, here now you're going to see that your AV valves are closed. Your tricuspid and your bicuspid valve are closed, and the pulmonary semilunar and aortic semilunar valve are open. Okay? So again, I could very well hint ask a question like, when the ventricles contract, which valves are open and which valves are closed? Okay, and so again, you would say that the bicuspid and tricuspid valve are closed, and the semilunar valves, pulmonary and aortic semilunar valves, are open. Okay, so the heart actions, again, continuing on with the heart actions, we're going to talk about how we get these heart sounds, the lub-dub, okay, of your heart. So heart sounds are due to these vibrations in the heart tissues that are actually associated with the closing of your valves. So the heart sounds can be described as your lub-dub sound, okay? And so that's that lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub that you would hear, again, if you were listening to your heart sounds. And so, of course, then your lub, as you can probably guess, are going to be the closing of your AV valves. So again, especially remember we're talking about your tricuspid and your bicuspid valves here. And the dub is going to be the closing of the semilunar valves. So this is going to be, again, the pulmonary and aortic semilunar valves. So, in here, sorry, it tells you that here. So again, there's the lub, and again, that occurs as the ventricles contract and the AV valves are closing. And the second sound, the dup, is going to occur as the ventricles relax and the aortic and the pulmonary valves are closing. So again, you don't have to know this. I just put this in here because it's interesting. This actually shows you where you can listen to your heart sounds. So if you happen to have a stethoscope at home, you can actually listen to your heart sounds in these 4 major places. And this is where you actually are, these 4 areas are basically designed to listen for leaky valves. And that's what typically a physician is doing when they're listening to your heart, is they're listening for those valve sounds. And if they hear kind of whizzing sound, or if they hear a clicking sound, that can mean that you can have a valve that isn't working properly or efficiently. And many people have murmurs. I actually have a murmur where I actually have a leaky valve. So again, that's what they're listening for when they're listening, and they listen to these 4 areas to listen to, to the different valves. So for example, here when you're listening between the second and the third, on the right side here, the second and the third, and again, this is counting down your ribs. So the second and the third rib, here you'd be listening for the aortic valve. On the other side here, between the second and third, on the other side of the sternum, here you'd be listening for the pulmonary valve. So again, kind of interesting to see why they listen to those 4 areas and what valves they're listening for. Now, when we talk about the actual contraction of the heart and how it contracts, obviously again, your cardiac muscle tissue is made up of your cardiac muscle fibers. And if you remember those cardiac muscle fibers, if you looked at them, they have those intercalated discs where, again, they literally have these little gap junctions in those intercalated discs. And that way then they can, again, share the ions that are, again, moving into and out of, and especially, again, in terms of contraction here. If we have a release of calcium, which, remember, stimulates contraction, we can get the release of calcium from this cell, and then it'll pass that calcium into the next cell. And what that does is that allows, that's a little more information, but I'm trying to connect the muscle lecture for you to this one. But what that does is that allows the heart to contract as a unit, or what we call a functional syncytium. So one exists in the atrium, meaning the atria will all contract together. So we call this an atrial syncytium. And then the ventricles will all contract together, and we call that ventricular syncytium. So we're going to talk about how this happens here now. So again, we have a specialized cardiac muscle tissue that actually is going to conduct impulses throughout the muscle tissue, the myocardium. And it's going to comprise what we call the cardiac conduction system. So we have these specialized cells that are actually these self-exciting cells. And these self-exciting cardiac muscle cells are called, they're concentrated in this one area called the SA node. Okay? So again, the SA node consists of these muscle cells that are self-exciting. They can excite themselves. And this is what we call the sinoatrial node, or the SA node, or pacemaker. Okay, and that's why oftentimes you hear kind of the general public call it the pacemaker of the heart. That's the SA node. And it's located on the posterior, or the back side again, of the right atrium. And that's going to generate the impulses for the entire heartbeat. So this is now how that the impulses are going to be spread. So the SA node, again, initially sends off that impulse. That impulse spreads, okay, throughout the atria to the, what we call the atrial syncytium, right? It causes both atria to contract. So the SA node, again, literally is going to cause the atria to contract. And as it contracts, impulses are going to travel from the atria through these junctional fibers that are going to lead to the AV node. The AV node is what we call the atrioventricular node. It's the node that's between the atrium and the ventricles. And it's located actually in the interventricular septum. And so that AV node is now going to pass again the impulse from the atria to the ventricles. So then from the AV node, you have a branch coming off called the AV bundle, or also sometimes better known as the bundle of His. Okay, and then that bundle of His is going to branch off into your right and your left bundle branches. And then from there, your bundle branches are going to branch into the Purkinje fibers. Okay, and those Purkinje fibers, fibers, not fibrils, fibers, Purkinje fibers. And those Purkinje fibers, again, are going to stimulate contraction of your papillary muscles at the same time that they can stimulate contraction of the ventricles to contract. Or at the same time that your ventricles are going to be stimulated to contract. So that's kind of how the conduction flows through the heart. So let me go over this. It's easier to kind of picture on this diagram. So here's the SA node. The SA node, again, is the pacemaker of the heart. The SA node is going to send out the impulses for basically and again, remember the SA node consists of these self-excitable cells. So they're going to pass on this electrical impulse to the rest of the muscle cells in the atria. So that's what you're seeing here, causing the atria to contract as an atrial syncytium. Then, again, that impulse is going to travel down these fibers called junctional fibers, and they're all going to come together at the AV node. Okay, so all these junctional fibers will come together at the AV node. Then the AV node will pass on this impulse from the junctional fibers to the AV bundle, or what we call the bundle of His. Same thing. This AV bundle is the bundle of His. And then that bundle of His is going to branch into the left and the right bundle branches, and then these left and right bundle branches are going to branch into the Purkinje fibers. And these Purkinje fibers are what are going to cause the ventricles to contract. They'll pass on that impulse to the ventricles, causing the ventricles to contract. And then they'll also, again, pass on that impulse to the papillary muscles, causing them to contract and causing them to close those valves. Okay, so an electrocardiogram is a way in which we can read the electrical changes that are occurring in the heart due to the cardiac conduction cycle. And so an electrocardiogram is the same thing as an EKG. Okay, EKG is the kind of German version, that's why there's the K. But we still use the term EKG, even though technically it's really ECG, right? But again, that electrocardiogram just gives us a recording of the electrical conduction through the heart. And so what you're going to see in your EKG is we can break down the waves that are going to be drawn in the cardiac cycle. And the first wave that you're going to see is what's called the P wave. And that's going to correspond to the depolarization of your atria, both your atria. Okay, so that's just before the atria contract. Then the QRS complex is going to correspond to the depolarization of your ventricles. And it hides the repolarization of the atria. So now that we've talked about depolarization and repolarization, you know what that is in terms of the nervous cells. The same thing is going to be happening in these muscle cells here just before they contract. So again, these muscle cells, the atria, these muscle cells are going to depolarize, okay, just before the atria contract. And then just after the atria contract, we're going to have repolarization of the atria. But you don't see repolarization of the atria on the EKG because it's hidden by the depolarization of the ventricles because they happen at the same time. And the depolarization of the ventricles is a much bigger event. So that's what we see in terms of our EKG for the next wave, is the QRS wave. So this is what you see here. Here you can see your first wave is that P wave. And that's, again, atrial depolarization, okay? And what's cool here is they show you, in this diagram here, there's the P wave, there's atrial depolarization. And so, again, that cell is going to depolarize just before it contracts. So, again, it's the atrial depolarization, and this is a little more than you have to know, but some of you are gonna like this connection, okay, to the muscle, the muscle lecture that we did. So what happens here is as the muscle cell becomes depolarized, okay, then that's what's going to cause the calcium to be released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Remember that calcium then goes and binds to the troponin tropomyosin complex, pulling it again off of that myosin binding site, and then boom, the myosin heads can again form that cross bridge and undergo their power stroke. So that's why you see, again, there's a little delay right after. Here we have the depolarization of the cell, and then there's contraction after that, okay? So there you can see there's atrial contraction in the blue. So again, the cell becomes depolarized, and then boom, right after that, the cell contracts. And then obviously, again, in the atria, all the cells are contracting as one. That's hence the name atrial syncytium. So this P wave here is all of those atrial cells depolarizing, okay? Now, again, as these cells repolarize, that's going to happen here. We're not going to see the repolarization of those cells because what ends up happening is we see the depolarization of the ventricles. So that's the QRS wave. This QRS wave is showing you the depolarization of the ventricles. And obviously that's a much bigger event because the ventricles, there's just simply there are more cells in the ventricles because the ventricles are much larger, and that's why you see a much bigger change in terms of electrical conductivity here in the ventricles versus than just the atria. It's just because the ventricles are bigger and they have more cells. So here the QRS wave is our depolarization of the ventricles, and then you see right after that, boom, ventricles contract. Okay, and then here we have our T wave, which will be, our T wave is actually our repolarization of the ventricles. And I don't have that on there, but, I guess, I don't know why we didn't include, I'm not sure why we didn't include the T wave here, but the T wave is actually the repolarization of the ventricles. Okay, so that's your P, QRS, and your T wave. Okay, so again, P wave is the depolarization of the atria. QRS is the depolarization of your ventricles, and T is the repolarization of your ventricles. And again, we just don't see the repolarization of the atrix. It's hidden here by the QRS wave, which is your depolarization of the ventricles. Okay, so again, P wave, atrial depolarization, QRS, ventricular depolarization. T wave is going to be the repolarization of the ventricles. So now you can see what's happening in terms of an EKG. Okay, so now we're going to get into regulation of the cardiac cycle. And so obviously there are going to be a number of factors that regulate the cardiac cycle. The amount of blood that's pumped at any one time has to adjust to the current needs of the body. So for example, again, obviously we're going to have a larger cardiac output if we're exercising because more oxygen is needed by those tissues. So again, the amount of blood that's going to be pumped out at any one time has to adjust to the current needs of the body. The SA node is also going to be innervated by branches of the autonomic nervous system. So, for example, obviously we have the sympathetic nervous system, and the sympathetic nervous system, when stimulated, will speed up the heart rate. Parasympathetic nervous system also innervates the heart and innervates specifically again the SA node, and the parasympathetic impulse can slow down the firing of the SA node. So the sympathetic nervous system, remember, sympathetic is your fight or flight. Again, we want to speed up the impulses from the SA node, speed up the heart rate so we can pump out blood faster the tissues so that we can, get more oxygen to our tissues so we can run away from the scary man or the scary woman, could be, right? Or the scary bear. And parasympathetic impulses are our rest and digest. So we want to slow down that heart rate. So again, we're going to slow down the firing at the SA node. And then remember that the cardiovascular control center exists in the medulla oblongata. And so it actually is going to use information from what are called baro. I don't know why. I apologize. I don't know why my version of PowerPoint does this every once in a while. It doesn't show all the letters on here. But again, the medulla oblongata is going to contain the cardiovascular control center, and it's going to use information that's brought in from baroreceptors, or these are simply pressure receptors. They're detecting, again, the pressure of blood in your blood vessels. So baroreceptors in the blood vessels. Okay, so speaking of blood vessels, let's talk now a little bit about blood vessels. So the blood vessels, again, we're going to talk about it, are going to be your arteries, which are going to branch into these arterioles, which then branch into capillaries. And then those capillaries then are going to branch back into venules and then into veins. And so this forms what we call a closed tube, or a closed circulatory system. That's going to carry blood away from the heart to the cells and then back again. So arteries and arterioles. Arteries are these strong elastic vessels that are adapted for carrying high pressure blood. So again, the pressure inside your arteries is going to be much higher because, again, your ventricle, especially your left ventricle, has just, or your right ventricle, because that's carrying, again, the blood in the form of the pulmonary arteries. So again, your arteries are going to be closest to the ventricles, the pump that just, again, pumped that blood out at that high pressure. So that's why our arteries are going to be carrying high pressure. And they need to be, because they're either carrying the blood to the tissues or carrying the blood, again, to the lungs. And so they're these very strong elastic vessels. They have 3 layers to them: the tunica interna, the tunica media, and the tunica externa. And they are capable of vasoconstriction and dilation under sympathetic control. So the sympathetic nervous system can cause vasoconstriction of these blood vessels when needed, or again, vasodilation of these blood vessels. So these are the 3 layers, again, to your artery. So if you look here, you have the tunica interna, which is it's made up of what we call endothelium. And endothelium is just going to be a type of epithelial tissue. So we have the endothelial lining that makes up the tunica interna. And then we're going to have the tunica media and then the tunica externa. Now, what's interesting is if you look here, this is kind of cool because this shows you the difference. Ooh, sorry about that. I'm not sure what I just did there. Let me unblock my screen here. So if you look here, this is neat because this shows you the difference between arteries and veins. So if you look here in an artery, you're going to see one of the big differences is that in an artery, the tunica media is much larger. And this tunica media is going to consist of smooth muscle. Okay? And that smooth muscle is going to be important, especially in the arteries, because it's going to help to maintain the high pressure in your arteries. That's why it's important for the arteries to have a thicker tunica media than the veins, because maintaining that high pressure in the veins is not as important, but maintaining that high pressure in the arteries is very important. So that's one thing that you'll notice. And then here you're going to see that the veins are going to have valves in them. Arteries have no valves, no valves. Veins need to have valves because the pressure of blood is going to be lower in your veins. And since your blood pressure is lower in your veins, we don't want the blood to backflow. So we have these valves to prevent backflow of blood. We don't have to worry about backflow of blood in the arteries because the blood pressure is so high in your arteries. Okay? So this kind of shows you some of the differences between those. But again, the three major layers that you're going to see in both your arteries and veins are going to be the tunica interna, the tunica media, and the tunica externa. And that tunica media is always going to be, sorry, let me go back here for a second. That tunica media will always be the smooth muscle layer. The endothelial lining is going to be, again, this layer of this epithelial lining. And then the tunica externa is going to be this fibrous, dense fibrous connective tissue. Okay. So now our capillaries, when we talk about capillaries, our capillaries are going to connect our arterioles, right, which are our smaller branches off of arteries. They're going to connect our arterioles to our venules, which are small branches off of our veins there. And our capillaries are made of what we call simple squamous epithelium. So remember, the simple squamous epithelium is going to be this, the flat pancake cells, and simple, it's only one layer. So literally our capillaries are only one cell layer thick. And the reason that they're so thin is that this is where gas exchange is going to occur. This is where, again, where oxygen is going to move from the blood into the tissues, and carbon dioxide is going to move. So here oxygen's moving. Let me just show you here. Oxygen's going to move from the blood into the tissues, and then carbon dioxide is going to move from the tissues into the blood. So they have to be thin. So that's why simple squamous epithelium is the perfect tissue for this, because they're these nice flat pancake cells. Now, what's also cool about the capillary beds is we have these things called precapillary sphincters. And these little precapillary sphincters are going to be these little muscular sphincters that can actually regulate the amount of blood entering a capillary bed, and are typically oftentimes controlled by the concentration of oxygen in a certain area. So let me show you what some of these sphincters look like here in just this next diagram. But real quick here, this is pretty cool. This is actually a slide here of a capillary, and what's cool is you can see in the capillary here, the capillaries are so small that the blood vessels actually move single file through the capillaries. And the reason that they do this, again, is that here our whole purpose is that we're trying, again, to expose as much surface area of that red blood vessel, or of that red blood cell as we can, again, to the surface of the capillary and to the tissues, because that's where we're doing gas exchange. So that way then, again, oxygen can be unloaded from those blood vessels into the tissues, and carbon dioxide can then be loaded into the blood. Okay, so here, this is kind of cool. This shows you these precapillary sphincters. So you can see here in this case, the precapillary sphincters are relaxed, and so blood is being shunted through this capillary bed. And here, in this case, the sphincters are contracted. So, for example, you could picture this happening in some of your superficial blood vessels in your extremities. So, let's say it's a really hot, warm day. Those sphincters are going to be relaxed, allowing the blood, again, to move through that capillary bed. But let's say that you're up in Flagstaff skiing and it's really cold out, and you have, a really cold wind chill. And what will happen is then these precapillary sphincters can actually contract and shunt blood through so that it doesn't travel through this entire capillary bed. And that helps us to maintain some heat so that we're not losing heat through that capillary bed. So again, those are those precapillary sphincters. Now, when we talk about these blood vessels, we can talk a little bit about how, we exchange fluid and with that nutrients through the capillaries. So hydrostatic pressure, or literally, again, pressure of that fluid. So you can picture hydrostatic pressure being just kind of like the pressure that you would see if you had a hose, right? And it's just that water pressure against the walls of the vessel. That's your hydrostatic pressure. So hydrostatic pressure is actually going to drive the passage of fluid into or out of capillaries. And or in this case, actually, I should say it's really going to drive the passage of fluids out of the capillaries. So when we're talking about driving fluid out of the capillaries, it's going to be that hydrostatic pressure, because your capillaries are basically like your hose, right? And so again, the water pressure inside that hose is going to push against some of that water. Let's say if you had holes in your hose, hydrostatic pressure would push against some of that liquid out of the hose. And that's exactly what's happening in your capillaries. Your capillaries, again, are going to be leaky to that fluid, and so that fluid will pass out of the capillaries into the surrounding tissues via hydrostatic pressure. Now, that's going to be on the arterial end, okay? As you continue, and let me draw this kind of out here. So here's your arterial, okay? And then it branches again into your capillaries here. I'll just draw two out. Branches into your capillaries here. What's going to happen is you have, again, high hydrostatic pressure in the capillaries on the arterial end. So they're going to lose some fluid, okay, out because they're leaky, dumping that fluid out of those capillaries into the tissue. Now, as they lose fluid, the hydrostatic pressure is going to get lower and lower and lower. And as you get towards the venule end, so this is your venule, this is your arterial. As you get closer to that venule end, and as you continue to lose fluid out of that capillary due to hydrostatic pressure, you hit a point where now the hydrostatic pressure isn't great enough inside the capillary to continue to lose fluid. So when that hydrostatic pressure drops at the venule end, then what happens is osmotic pressure will actually drive some fluid back in to the blood. And this causes much of the tissue fluid to return to the bloodstream. So just via osmotic pressure, okay? So again, and that's partially because we have in the blood, we have all this protein in here. And so as we build up fluid out in the tissues, then eventually we hit a point where we'll pull fluid back in due to osmosis. So that's exactly what this diagram is showing here. So what happens here is on the arterial end, okay, our hydrostatic pressure is greater than the osmotic pressure that would draw fluid back in. Okay, so on the arterial end, hydrostatic pressure, the pressure inside the hose, right, is greater than osmotic pressure. And so when that happens, again, fluid moves out of that capillary, okay? So we get a net outward pressure or a net outward movement of fluid, okay? Now as we continue to lose fluid, hydrostatic pressure drops, okay, lower, 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 until on our venule end here, hydrostatic pressure is actually less than osmotic pressure. And so what happens is the osmotic pressure is going to draw fluid back into that capillary, preventing it from losing too much fluid. So we have a net pressure drawing fluid back in. Okay. Now if you look here on the arterial end, you have a net outward pressure that's much greater than the net inward pressure, okay? So what this means is we're going to lose more fluid to the tissues than we are going to gain, okay? So we do lose some fluid to the tissues. It's just that we don't lose all of our fluid to the tissues. And then if for some reason, again, we collect, and we're going to get a buildup, right, of fluid in these tissues, the lymphatic vessels, and this is part of we haven't gotten into the lymphatic system yet, but we'll get there. The lymphatic system and these lymphatic vessels will actually collect the extra tissue fluid and then eventually return it to the blood later on. So I'll show you later on how the lymphatic system works. So this is kind of cool. This just shows you this transition point. So here, this is showing you how you can transition again from what happens in the arterial end, where we're literally pulling again fluid into the tissues, and then we hit this transition point where we start to bring fluid back into the blood vessels, into the capillaries. So here again, on the arterial end, our hydrostatic pressure is greater than our osmotic pressure, so we're going to have a net, again, loss of fluid from the, again, blood vessel, from the capillary here into the tissues. And then here on the venule end, because our hydrostatic pressure now is less than osmotic pressure, we're going to, again, see a net movement of fluid into that vessel. Okay, so venules and veins. When you look at veins, again, veins are thinner and less muscular than our arteries are. And remember, I showed you that tunica media is much thinner. So we don't need that thick muscular layer because the pressure inside our veins is going to be much less. So they don't carry that high pressure blood. And again, that's the reason they can be thinner. The walls of the veins can be thinner and less muscular. The veins also are going to function as kind of reservoirs for the blood. So again, they act as a reservoir in the body for our blood. And if you look again, the inside of these veins are going to have these valves, and those valves help to direct blood flow to the heart because pressure isn't very high in these valves. Or pressure isn't very high in your veins. We have these little valves to prevent backflow. And what happens then is that blood can kind of just pool up behind these valves until something like a muscle surrounding that vein contracts and pushes the blood again through that one-way valve towards the heart. So this is why it's actually very important for you if you're sitting on a long flight and the blood is just kind of pooling, especially in your legs, because again, gravity is going to tend to again help keep it there. So what you want to do is to kind of prevent blood clots from forming inside your veins here because the blood is just sitting here. You want to be able to move your legs, and that's why they tell you to, do something to move your legs, even if it's just kind of stretching your legs and contracting those muscles. Because what you're doing then is you're forcing that blood to move through those valves on up towards the heart. And that prevents the blood from just sitting there too long and starting to form clots. Also, since we're talking about these valves here, kind of interesting, varicose veins end up being these leaky valves. So varicose veins result from leaky valves. Blood pressure. Oh, and even more interesting, hemorrhoids. Oftentimes hemorrhoids are caused by varicose veins in the anal region. So a little bit of interesting information, trivia information for you there as well. So then blood pressure, when we talk about, again, measuring your blood pressure is the force of blood, obviously, against the inner walls of your blood vessels, anywhere in the cardiovascular system. Although when we talk about measuring your blood pressure, we're usually referring to arterial pressure. So we're usually referring to the pressure inside your arteries. And when we measure your blood pressure, we're again measuring arterial blood pressure. And we're going to see that the arterial blood pressure is going to rise and fall following these patterns that are set out by the cardiac cycle. atrial contraction and then ventricular contraction. So, and then relaxation. So during ventricular contraction, okay, that is when our ventricles contract and are forcing blood into the arteries. That's when arterial pressure is going to be at its maximum, at its highest. So this is what we call systolic pressure. Okay? And so systolic is the highest pressure. Then when the ventricles are relaxing, okay, and remember that for a brief moment, the ventricles and the atria are both going to be relaxed. For that brief moment, but most importantly, when the ventricles are relaxed, the arterial pressure is going to be at its lowest. And this is our diastolic pressure, okay, our resting pressure. So when you are measuring your blood pressure, again, you're taking basically the pressure when it's at its highest and when it's at its lowest in the blood vessels. And again, that highest pressure is your systolic blood pressure. And that's, again, when the ventricles are contracting. Okay, that's your highest pressure. And that lowest pressure, your diastolic pressure, is when the ventricles are relaxed. So, and this is kind of cool because this actually shows you again how that works in terms of, you put a pressure cuff on and then eventually you hear the sound, you hear that lip dub sound kind of the basically the blood again rushing into the arteries there. You hear that, and you can hear that systolic pressure, and then you can hear that diastolic pressure when you're releasing that cuff. So again, of course, you can hear the diastolic pressure when you finally release the cuff to a point where that highest pressure will allow blood to move through, and you hear that sound. And then the diastolic pressure, again, will be your lowest pressure. That's the last sound that you're going to hear. Because that, again, the blood is, your pressure in the cuff is no longer higher than that lowest pressure. So, again, that's probably a little more than, for some of you it might be interesting. I thought it might be interesting for some of you to see how that works. But really, again, what I want you to know is that your systolic pressure is when the ventricles are contracting, that's your highest pressure, and diastolic pressure is your lowest pressure when then the ventricles are relaxing. And so, and again, they tell you that for an average blood pressure, again, would be 120/70, but that really, they don't even like to consider that average because each individual is going to be different and each individual's average is going to be different. So whether or not your pressure, for me, for example, a blood pressure of 120/70 would be actually fairly high for me. So really, you need to know what your normal blood pressure is and to again, compare whether or not your blood pressure is high or not. Factors that influence arterial blood pressure are going to be things like, again, heart action. So, how hard is the heart pumping? How fast is the heart rate? Blood volume. So again, how much blood volume you have will impact arterial pressure. Resistance to flow. So for example, maybe you have plaques built up in your artery that are going to resist that flow. That will, again, increase arterial pressure. And then blood viscosity. So for example, if you were, again, doing some blood doping, and your blood was more viscous, that would also impact your arterial pressure. Control of your blood pressure. Blood pressure is going to be determined by two major factors: your cardiac output. Okay, so your cardiac output is going to be, again, that blood flow, again, that's being pumped out by the heart. So how much blood is being pumped out by the heart, and at what rate is going to impact blood pressure. And then your peripheral resistance is going to be resistance in the blood vessels. So, for example, again, that peripheral resistance would be greater in your blood vessels if you had plaques built up in your arteries. The cardiovascular control center, again, is going to be, as a reminder, in the medulla oblongata, and that's going to regulate both the heart, okay, as well as it's also going to regulate the smooth muscle in your blood vessels. Other factors that can influence blood pressure would be, emotional upset, obviously, exercise, or a rise in temperature can also affect your blood pressure as well. Venous blood flow. So I kind of already went over this, but this is kind of interesting. So again, your blood flow through the venous system is just partially the result of, again, the heart action, meaning that, as the heart pumps, it relies on that one pump from the ventricle, from the left ventricle, boom, that pumps again that blood out into the arteries and then through the capillary beds, and it's still on that one pump into the veins, okay, and then pushes it back to the heart. But again, you've got to remember that by the time it gets to the veins, the pressure is much lower in those blood vessels. So now we also rely on skeletal muscle contraction. So the skeletal muscles surrounding those veins, as they contract, they push on those veins and help to push that blood back to the heart. And again, remember, we have those one-way valves to keep blood from flowing backwards. Also, your breathing movements. So as you breathe and as the diaphragm moves down and compresses the abdominal cavity or compresses, again, the thoracic cavity, that helps to also put some pressure on some of those veins to push that blood back to the heart. And then also, again, we can get vasoconstriction of your veins. So we do have some control over the smooth muscle and the tunica media of your veins. So again, this is just showing you those one-way valves. So we have those nice one-way valves. So that way then, because pressure's lower, that will keep the blood from flowing backwards and keep it flowing towards the heart. Okay, so when we look at the passive circulation throughout the body's blood vessels can be divided into what we call the pulmonary circuit, and the pulmonary circuit is going to be this right here. This is your pulmonary circuit. So that's going to be the blood flow from the heart to the lungs and back to the heart. Okay, so your pulmonary circuit would consist of your pulmonary arteries, okay, carrying that deoxygenated blood away from the heart. So your pulmonary trunk, pulmonary arteries, then again the capillary beds in the lungs, and then the pulmonary veins coming back to the heart. That would be the makeup of your pulmonary circuit. Okay, then we have the systemic circuit. And the systemic circuit is going to be made up of everything else. It's of all of the vessels carrying blood from the heart to the rest of the body and back. So all of this is going to be your systemic circuit. Okay, so again, your systemic circuit is going to consist of the aorta, okay, that's pumping again blood out into the arteries that are traveling again up to your head and to your upper limbs, and then all the way down to your trunk and your lower limbs, and then the capillary beds, okay, for all of your tissues, and then the veins that are going to dump into the superior and inferior vena cava. So that will be the makeup of your systemic circuit. Okay, and so that's really pretty much the end of the lecture. The rest of these pictures are basically to help you out with lab, but for lecture you will not, I repeat, you will not be responsible for knowing the different arteries like the right common carotid, the right subclavian, the brachiocephalic. Again, that's for lab. So I put these pictures in here mainly to help you out with lab. Okay, so again, please remember all of these pictures, this picture, this one here, are not going to be on the lecture exam. They're just to help you out with lab. All right, so that concludes the cardiovascular system. So again, if you have any questions at all, please write in on the discussion board, or you can email me directly. And with that, have a good night.